You have lost someone. You know the feeling. That hollow, disorienting weight that settles into your chest and doesn't leave. The way the world keeps moving while you stand completely still. For a moment, everything that felt permanent suddenly isn't. Now imagine feeling that, with no hospital, no funeral home, no grief counselor, no religion telling you exactly what happens next, no coffin, no hearse, no burial plot pre-purchased by your parents, just you, a body, and the cold open world. For roughly 300,000 years, this was the only way humans knew death, and what they did with it will completely change how you think about grief, ritual, and what it means to be human. Death was not a distant event for your ancestors. It was close, constant, familiar in a way that modern life has carefully designed you never to experience. A child in a hunter-gatherer band had likely watched someone die before they turned 10. Your ancient body knew the smell of death, the weight of a body going cold, the particular silence that follows. And yet, they did not collapse. They did not abandon the dead. They did not simply walk away. They buried them, adorned them, grieved them, sometimes for days. The oldest confirmed intentional burial ever found dates to roughly 300,000 years ago in a cave called Rising Star in South Africa. Anthropologist Lee Berger and his team discovered the remains of Homo naledi, a small-brained hominin, not even fully modern human, deliberately placed deep inside a cave system in what appeared to be intentional disposal of the dead. The discovery shook the field. Scientists had long assumed that symbolic ritual behavior around death required a large, complex brain. Rising Star suggested otherwise. The impulse to do something with the dead may be far older and far more primal than anyone expected. But it was the Neanderthals who gave us some of the most striking early evidence. At Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, excavated by Ralph Solecki in the 1950s and 60s, the remains of at least 10 Neanderthals were found clustered together. One individual, now called Shanidar 1, had survived severe injuries that would have left him partially blind and with a useless arm. He lived for years after those injuries, which means someone took care of him, someone fed him, someone chose to keep him alive when he could no longer fully contribute to survival. That is not the behavior of an animal. That is the behavior of a community that had already decided the sick, the old, and the dying were still worth something. Around 100,000 years ago, at a site called Kafse Cave in Israel, anatomically modern humans were burying their dead with deliberate care. A young child was found interred with deer antlers placed across the body. No accident, no random scatter. Someone chose those antlers, placed them there, and covered the grave. Why? We cannot know for certain. But archaeologist Francesco, who has spent decades studying the emergence of symbolic thinking in early humans, argues that deliberate burial with objects is one of the clearest markers of a mind capable of abstraction, a mind that could imagine something beyond the physical. That a child buried with antlers suggests someone believed the child was going somewhere or needed something for the journey. So let's reconstruct what death looked like inside a small band of hunter-gatherers roughly 50,000 years ago. Your band is perhaps 30 people. You have known every single one of them your entire life. When one of them dies, say an elder woman, a grandmother who knew where the water was in the dry season, who remembered which plants made the fever break, the loss is not abstract. It is immediate, practical, devastating. The body is not taken away by strangers. There are no strangers here. The people who loved her are the ones who tend to her. They wash her if there is water. They may paint her with red ochre, iron-rich pigment found in burial sites across Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, used so consistently that researchers like Lynn Wadley have identified it as one of the oldest symbolic substances humans used, possibly linked to blood, life, and transformation. They lay objects beside her, a shell, a tool she used, something that was hers, and then they grieve, loudly, physically, together. Anthropologist Barbara King, in her book Evolving God, documents grief behavior across primates and early humans and argues that the capacity for grief is not a human invention, it is an evolutionary inheritance. Chimpanzees have been observed sitting with dead infants for days, refusing to leave. Elephants return to the bones of their dead year after year. Grief, at its root, is what happens when a social brain loses a social bond it depended on for survival. Your ancient ancestors did not grieve because they were sentimental. They grieved because their nervous systems were built around attachment, and attachment, when severed, causes real physiological pain. But here is the counterintuitive twist. Your ancestors may have actually been better at grief than you are. Modern death has been almost completely removed from daily life. In most wealthy countries today, the dying are moved to hospitals, the dead are handled by professionals, the body is embalmed, dressed, placed in a sealed box, and lowered into the ground by people who are paid to do it efficiently. You are rarely asked to touch the dead. You are rarely expected to sit with them for days. You are given a few days of bereavement leave, then expected to return to your desk. For most of human history, grief was communal, extended, and embodied. It was witnessed. The whole band felt it together. There was no timeline for recovery because there was no separation between the grieving person and the community holding them. Anthropologist Paul Rosenblatt, who studied grief across cultures in the 1970s, found that societies with more collective, ritualized mourning practices showed less long-term, complicated grief, the kind that becomes chronic depression, isolation, and dysfunction. Your ancestors cried together, wailed together, sat in the dark together, told stories about the person who was gone, keeping them alive in language before language was even fully formed, and the grave was not the end of the relationship with the dead. At Sunghir in Russia, dated to around 34,000 years ago, 2 children were found buried head-to-head in an extraordinary grave. They were covered in thousands of hand-carved mammoth ivory beads. Researchers estimate it would have taken roughly 10,000 hours of labor to produce them all. The children wore fox-tooth pendants. Beside them lay spears made from straightened mammoth tusks, a feat of craftsmanship that required sustained heat treatment over days. Someone spent an enormous amount of time and effort equipping these children for whatever came next. These were not throwaway bodies. These were children who mattered intensely to the people who outlived them. There is a word for what your ancestors were doing. Archaeologists call it mortuary behavior, but a better word might simply be love, expressed in the only language the living could still speak to the dead: objects, ochre, placement, and time. The dead were sometimes kept close in other ways. In some early communities, the bones of ancestors were revisited, reburied, rearranged. At Çatalhöyük in Turkey, a Neolithic settlement dating to around 9,000 years ago, the dead were buried beneath the floors of homes. The living slept directly above their ancestors, not out of morbidity, out of continuity. The dead were not gone, they were beneath you, part of the structure of daily life, part of the foundation. And here is where it comes back to you. You live in a culture that has professionalized death so completely that most people reach middle age without ever having been in the same room as a dead body. Death has been made invisible, clinical, and outsourced. And yet grief has not disappeared. It has simply lost its community container. It has become a private interior experience in a nervous system that was built for collective mourning. When you feel that hollow weight, when you lose someone and the world keeps moving and no one around you quite knows what to say, what you are experiencing is an ancient system firing without the ancient support structure it was designed for. Your ancestors would have held you. They would have sat with you in the dark. They would have wailed with you until the wailing turned into story, and the story turned into something you could carry. You wake up the morning after someone dies. The world feels wrong, smaller and larger at the same time. For 300,000 years, you would not have faced that morning alone.